Welcome to Night Creepypasta Rules. In the quiet corners of rural England, where history breathes in stone and shadow, some houses hold secrets older than memory. Chapelwood Manor. A renovated church, they called it. A refuge? I hoped. But beneath the polished veneer, beneath the ancient eaves, something waited. Something that demanded not just silence, but a specific kind of silence. And 3 rules. 3 chilling, impossible rules to survive the night. This is not a story for the faint of heart. This is the chilling account of Chapelwood, of Lilia and Caleb, and the ancient song that almost claimed them. You are about to step into a world where the past is not past, and the rules of survival are written in terror. Prepare to listen closely. The true horror lies in the details, and the twist. It will leave you questioning everything. Tell me, what forgotten song do you fear hearing most? Share your thoughts below, and if you dare to face the shadows with us again, consider subscribing. Pray you don't break the rules. The first rule of Chapelwood Manor was that some silences screamed louder than any bell, especially the silence that followed an unscheduled chime from the derelict chapel tower. That particular silence, thick with unspoken dread and the scent of damp Vermont earth, greeted me as my taxi navigated the winding, overgrown driveway towards the imposing stone facade of the manor itself. It loomed out of the late afternoon mist, a Gothic sentinel brooding amidst a wilderness of ancient, gnarled trees, its windows like dark, vacant eyes, staring out at a world it seemed to have long forgotten. My name is Miss Coraline Meadowes, or it was, before the debacle surrounding the Serpent's Codex. My translation of that obscure pre-Babylonian text had been hailed as a breakthrough, then whispered about in hushed, horrified tones when inexplicable phenomena, unsettling dreams, bouts of collective hysteria, even a localized tremor, seemed to follow its public dissemination. The academic world, once my sanctuary, had become a place of pointed fingers and cautious distance. Chapelwood, with its promise of isolation and the simple, tangible task of tutoring 2 young children, felt less like a job and more like a refuge, a place to quiet the echoes of my own calamitous scholarship. Mr. Silas Armitage, the children's guardian and my new employer, met me at the massive oak door. He was a man who seemed to have stepped from the pages of a Victorian novel. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and eyes the color of polished obsidian. They were eyes that appraised, calculated, and I suspected, rarely missed a thing. His handshake was brief, his smile a fleeting, cool courtesy. "Meadowes," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that resonated in the cavernous entrance hall. "Welcome to Chapelwood. I trust your journey was untroubled." There was an emphasis on the last word that I couldn't quite decipher. He led me through shadowy corridors, lined with ancestral portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to follow our progress. The air was cool, smelling of beeswax, old paper, and something else. A faint, sweet, almost cloying aroma like lilies on the cusp of decay. Lilia and Caleb are sensitive children, Mr. Armitage stated, pausing before a heavy carved door. Their upbringing has been somewhat unconventional, given the tragic loss of their parents. They require a gentle hand, but also a firm adherence to certain established household protocols. For their well-being, of course. He opened the door to a surprisingly bright, if sparsely furnished, schoolroom. 2 children, twins no older than 8, sat at a large mahogany table, their dark heads bent over sketchbooks. Lilia, the girl, looked up first. She had her guardian's dark hair, but her eyes were a startling, intelligent blue, and they met mine with a direct, unnervingly adult scrutiny. Caleb, her brother, was slighter, his gaze more timid, flickering towards his sister as if for reassurance before offering me a shy, hesitant glance. A woman stood silently by the window, her hands clasped. She was introduced as Miss Tabitha Finch, the housekeeper. Her face was a mask of stoic lines, her eyes holding a deep, weary sadness that seemed to absorb the light. She merely nodded at me, a curt, almost dismissive gesture. After a brief, stilted introduction to the children, Mr. Armitage led me to a small, adjacent study he designated as my own. It was here, amidst towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound tomes, that he outlined the rules. Chapelwood, as you may have gathered, Miss Meadowes, is a place of particular resonances, he began, his obsidian eyes fixing on mine. The children, Lydia and Caleb, are especially attuned to these. Therefore, for their safety and tranquility, 3 directives must be scrupulously observed. I waited, a familiar sense of academic caution, or perhaps something more primal, prickling at the back of my neck. First, he said, his voice dropping slightly, the old chapel and its bell tower are strictly off limits to the children unless accompanied by myself or Miss Finch. However, children can be inventive. If by some chance you find them playing in the tower and the bell should toll, a single clear chime, where no one is physically pulling the rope, you are to bring them down immediately, without question or delay, a bell tolling on its own. My unease deepened. Second, Mr. Armitage continued, his gaze unwavering. Within the chapel, upon the old pulpit, rests a large leather-bound volume. It is a family heirloom of purely historical interest, but its contents are unsuitable for young minds. Under no circumstances are Lilia or Caleb to be permitted to read from it, or even to handle it extensively. He paused. Its influence can be disquieting. The scent of lilies seemed to intensify for a moment, a wave of cloying sweetness that made my head spin. And third, his voice was now a near whisper, compelling and absolute. There may be occasions, rare, I trust, when one of the twins, typically Lilia, may begin to speak in a language they could not possibly know, Latin perhaps, or an older tongue, or they may recite passages of scripture or poetry far beyond their years and comprehension. If this occurs, and critically, Ms. Meadowes, if the other twin appears frightened or distressed by this display, you are to begin singing children's songs, nursery rhymes, as loudly and as cheerfully as you can muster. Continue until the episode passes. This was beyond mere eccentricity. These were not the rules of a normal household. They were the protocols of a place teetering on the edge of something else entirely. Mr. Armitage, I began, my voice carefully neutral. These are rather unique directives. May I ask their origin, or the nature of the sensitivities you mentioned? A thin, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. The Thorne family, Miss Meadowes, has always possessed a profound connection to the echoes of the past, to the unspoken histories that permeate places like Chapelwood. Some echoes. His gaze drifted towards a window overlooking the distant, shadowed spire of the chapel. Ere best left undisturbed, their voices unamplified. Your role here is to educate, to nurture, and above all, to ensure those echoes remain whispers, not shouts. He then informed me he would be departing for several weeks on an acquisitions trip for his collection, leaving me in charge with Miss Finch to manage the household. His confidence in my ability to adhere to his simple rules was, he assured me, absolute. As he left the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind him with a sound of quiet finality, I was left alone with the weight of his admonitions. The scent of lilies and old paper filled the air, and from somewhere far off, carried on the sighing Vermont wind, I thought I heard the faint, solitary chime of a distant bell, or perhaps it was merely the first whisper of Chapelwood's uneasy silence. I'd stasis fury. I all war. Be what shy. My first few days at Chapelwood were a study in subdued unease. Lilia and Caleb were, as Mr. Armitage had described, sensitive children. Lilia possessed an unnerving intelligence, her questions often veering into philosophical territories far beyond her years, her dark blue eyes seeming to absorb everything with a quiet intensity. Caleb was her shadow, more prone to silences, his gaze often fixed on some distant point only he could see, his small hand frequently seeking his sister's. They played their own quiet, intricate games in the sprawling gardens or the dust-moted library, their whispered conversations often unintelligible to me, yet hinting at a private world rich with unspoken rules and shared understandings. The chapel, a gray stone edifice half swallowed by ivy and encroaching woods, was a constant brooding presence at the edge of the manicured lawns. Mr. Armitage's prohibition seemed only to heighten its allure for the twins. I often found their gaze drifting towards its shadowed doorway, or the crumbling stone of its bell tower. The air around it felt different, colder, carrying that persistent, faint scent of lilies and damp earth, even on dry days. It was during a late afternoon, about a week into my tenure, that the first rule was put to the test. I had been reading in the sunroom, the children supposedly occupied with art supplies. A sudden, intuitive prickle of alarm made me look up. They were gone. A quick search led me, with a sinking heart, towards the chapel. Peeking through the warped wooden door, I saw them. Lilia and Caleb were halfway up the narrow winding stone staircase of the bell tower, their small figures silhouetted against the grimy arched window. "Lilia! Caleb!" I called, my voice sharper than intended. "You know you're not supposed to be in there." They froze. Lilia looked down, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. Caleb just looked frightened. Before I could say more, it happened. A single, clear, resonant toll echoed from the great bronze bell above them. It was a deep, mournful sound, vibrating through the ancient stones, through the very air I breathed. There was no wind. The heavy bell rope, thick with dust and cobwebs, hung utterly still far below them. No one had touched it. Lilia gasped, her defiance vanishing, replaced by a wide-eyed, almost ecstatic awe as she stared up at the bell. Caleb whimpered, pressing himself against the cold stone wall. "Bring them down immediately." Mr. Armitage's voice, cold and precise, echoed in my mind. My heart hammered against my ribs. I forced myself up the narrow, treacherous stairs, the air growing colder with each step, the scent of lilies and something else, a faint metallic tang, like old incense or stale wine, growing stronger. When I reached them, Lilia was still staring at the bell, a strange, dreamy smile on her face. Caleb was trembling. "Come on," I said, my voice strained, trying to keep the tremor out of it. "Down. Now." I took each by the hand, their small fingers cold in mine. As we descended, I could hear it, a faint, almost inaudible chorus of whispers, like wind sighing through 1,000 unseen cracks in the tower, or perhaps a multitude of voices humming a discordant, ancient plain song. It seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Once we were back on solid ground, the whispers faded, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered. Later that evening, Dr. Alaric Graves, the local historian Mr. Armitage had mentioned, paid a visit. He was a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a slightly rumpled, academic air. He brought a selection of illustrated children's histories for the twins and engaged them in easy conversation. To me, he was courteous, asking about my background in philology with genuine interest. He seemed concerned for the children, his gaze lingering on them with a protective warmth. "Chapelwood has a layered history, Miss Meadowes," he said as Miss Finch served tea. The Thorns were one of the founding families of this valley. The chapel itself dates back to a rather fervent religious sect that settled here in the early 18th century. They had some unique ideas about communion and auditory revelation. He glanced towards the chapel, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. Miss Finch, who had been silently refilling teacups, paused. "The bell knows when to speak, Doctor," she said, her voice a low, toneless murmur. "It always has. It remembers the old songs, and it warns when the wrong ears are listening." She gave me a brief, unreadable look before retreating to the shadows of the kitchen. After Dr. Graves had left, I found myself drawn back to the library. In a dusty folio containing architectural drawings of the estate, I found a detailed sketch of the chapel. Beside the intricate rendering of the bell tower, penned in a spidery, archaic hand, was a small Latin inscription, Vox Umbrae Resonant. My blood ran cold. Let the voice of the shadow resound. The incident in the bell tower left an indelible mark. Caleb became more withdrawn, prone to startled jumps at sudden noises. Lilia, conversely, seemed to develop an almost obsessive fascination with the chapel. Her sketches now filled with images of bells, ancient symbols, and shadowy figures in long robes. My attempts to steer their education towards more conventional subjects were met with a polite but palpable disinterest, especially from Lilia. My own research into Chapelwood's history, aided by some obscure local pamphlets Dr. Graves had discreetly left for me, painted a disquieting picture. The fervent religious sect he'd mentioned was known as the Silent Cantors, the Silent Chanters. They believed that true divinity could only be accessed through a combination of specific linguistic invocations, complex musical harmonies, and a state of heightened spiritual receptivity, often induced in their acolytes, particularly children, through fasting and sensory deprivation. Their leader, a charismatic but reportedly unstable figure named Brother Theron, had vanished under mysterious circumstances, along with several of his young followers, shortly before the sect disbanded. The chapel had stood empty for generations until the Thorns acquired the estate. The second rule came into play during a period of relentless autumn rain, when the children were confined indoors and growing restless. Mr. Armitage, before his departure, had insisted that the chapel be aired out weekly, a task he delegated to me with the children, assisting under my direct supervision, ostensibly to learn responsibility. It was a charade, I suspected, to ensure the chapel remained accessible. On one such occasion, while I was attempting to unjam a stuck window in the sacristy, Lilia, with the preternatural quietness she sometimes exhibited, slipped away. I found her in the main sanctuary, standing before the old, worm-eaten pulpit. The great leather-bound book, its cover dark and featureless with age, its brass clasps, tarnished green, lay open. Lilia wasn't reading it in the conventional sense. Her fingers were tracing the strange, spidery script and the intricate, almost hypnotic musical notations that filled its vellum pages. Caleb stood beside her, his small face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, tugging at her sleeve. "Lilia?" I called, trying to keep the alarm out of my voice. She looked up, her blue eyes unfocused, a faint, almost ecstatic smile playing on her lips. "It's singing, Miss Meadowes," she whispered. "Can't you hear it? Such beautiful, sad songs." A wave of oppressive coldness rolled through the chapel, far more intense than the damp chill of the old stone. The scent of lilies, usually faint, became a cloying, suffocating perfume, mingled with the sharp, metallic tang I'd noticed in the bell tower. I hurried forward, my hand reaching out to close the book. As my fingers brushed the ancient leather, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a thrumming energy that seemed to resonate deep within my bones. I slammed it shut, the sound echoing unnaturally in the vaulted space. Lilia blinked, the dreamy expression fading. replaced by a flicker of something else. Resentment, or perhaps disappointment. Caleb visibly relaxed. "That book is not for you, Lilia," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Mr. Armitage was very clear. Later that day, Lilia began to hum. Soft, meandering melodies, unlike any children's tunes I knew. They were complex, melancholic, and disturbingly beautiful, and they bore an uncanny resemblance to the cadences suggested by the strange musical notations I'd glimpsed in the Forbidden Codex. With my background in ancient languages and a rudimentary understanding of early musical forms, I recognized fragments, not specific words, but phonetic structures, resonant vowels, and guttural stops that hinted at a lost liturgical language, one designed for incantation, not communication. Miss Fink's behavior grew more erratic. I found her one evening standing outside the locked chapel door, her head bowed, muttering something under her breath. She clutched a wilting bouquet of white lilies. When she saw me, she started, her eyes wide and haunted, before scurrying away without a word. The library, once a refuge, now felt charged. I found myself drawn to Mr. Armitage's private collection, usually kept under lock and key, but which Miss Finch, in a rare moment of forgetfulness, or perhaps deliberate action, had left accessible. His acquisitions weren't just antiques. They were specialized. Treatises on acoustic resonance and sacred architecture, monographs on glossolalia and induced ecstatic states, rare editions of apocryphal texts detailing rituals involving the harmonic alignment of juvenile voices. Mr. Armitage was not just a guardian. He was a scholar of the very forces that seemed to be stirring within Chapelwood. The shift in Lilia was subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. Her already precocious vocabulary expanded to include archaic, almost biblical phrasing. Her gaze would often become distant, as if she were listening to something beyond the range of normal hearing. Caleb, in turn, grew more anxious, his sleep plagued by nightmares he couldn't articulate, his waking hours spent clinging ever closer to me, or paradoxically, to the very sister who seemed to be drifting away from him. The atmosphere in Chapelwood grew heavier, the silences between the wind's moans and the house's creaks filled with an almost palpable tension. The scent of lilies was now a near constant presence, sometimes so strong it was nauseating. I felt perpetually on edge, my academic training battling a rising tide of primal fear. The third rule was invoked on a stormy Tuesday evening. Dinner had been a strained affair, Lilia quiet and brooding, Caleb barely touching his food. Afterwards, as I was attempting to engage them in a game of checkers in the dim firelit drawing room, Lilia suddenly pushed the board away, her head tilted, as if listening to an unheard prompter. Her eyes, usually a bright, intelligent blue, glazed over, becoming flat and vacant. Then she spoke. Her voice, usually light and childlike, dropped an octave, becoming resonant, almost masculine, imbued with an unnerving ancient authority. She began to recite, fluently and without hesitation, in a classical, grammatically perfect Latin that sent shivers down my spine. It was a passage I vaguely recognized from my studies of obscure heretical texts, a dark inversion of a creation myth, speaking of a silent cantor who wove the universe from unheard sound and forgotten words, and who awaited the harmony of the innocent to complete his eternal chorus. Caleb let out a choked sob, scrambling backwards, knocking over a small table. He pressed his hands over his ears, his small body shaking violently. "No, Lilia, no!" he cried, his voice thin with terror. "Don't let him sing, not the Star Eater's song. If one twin starts to speak in Latin, and the other looks frightened, begins singing children's songs very loudly." My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but the sight of Caleb's terror spurred me to action. My mind, trained in the cadences of dead languages, now fumbled for the simplest of melodies. "Row, row, row your boat," I began, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength, volume. "Gently down the stream," Lilia, or the thing speaking through her, faltered. The resonant Latin stumbled, the ancient authority in her voice wavering. She blinked, her eyes momentarily clearing. She looked at me, a flicker of confusion, then at her terrified brother. The alien presence seemed to recede, like a tide pulling back from the shore. I continued singing, louder now, switching to "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Then, "Itsy Bitsy Spider," the mundane, cheerful lyrics a bizarre counterpoint to the oppressive, ancient dread that still clung to the room. Slowly, the tension in Lilia's small frame eased. The vacant look left her eyes, replaced by her usual, albeit subdued, intelligence. She looked around, dazed. "Meadowes," she said, her voice her own again. Small and uncertain. "Why are you singing so loudly? Did I fall asleep?" But Caleb was still inconsolable, pointing a trembling finger at his sister. "It wasn't Lilia," he sobbed. It was the man from the book. The one with no face, only a song. The man from the book. The Star Eater. My blood ran cold. Later that night, after the children were finally fitfully asleep, I received a rare call from Dr. Graves. His voice was urgent. "Coraline, I need to see you. It's about Mr. Armitage and the Thorns. I found something. Something in Silas' correspondence with Lydia and Caleb's father. It's not good. It suggests Armitage isn't just a passive guardian. He's an active participant. He believes the children are keys." Before I could ask more, the line crackled and went dead. The storm outside intensified, the wind shrieking like a tortured soul. I found myself staring at the locked door of the chapel, visible from my study window, a dark silhouette against the bruised, turbulent sky. The rules were not just safeguards. They were part of a larger, more sinister design. And I, the unwitting GSI, was caught in the middle of it. The echoes of Chapelwood were no longer content to whisper. They were beginning to demand an audience. The storm that had been threatening all evening broke with a terrifying elemental fury. Wind lashed the ancient stones of Chapelwood. Rain hammered against the leaded glass windows like angry fists. And the power, inevitably, flickered and died, plunging the manor into a disorienting primal darkness, relieved only by the strobing. The strobing, theatrical flashes of lightning. The children, already unsettled, were now terrified. Caleb clung to me, whimpering, while Lilia sat bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide and unnervingly luminous in the gloom, as if reflecting the storm's own wild energy. Dr. Graves' truncated call, his warning about Armitage being an active participant, echoed in my mind. Keys to what? And what was this Cantor that Caleb had babbled about? This man from the book with no face, only a song. It was Miss Finch who provided the first tangible piece of the horrifying puzzle. She appeared at my door, a flickering oil lamp held in a trembling hand. Her usual stoic composure shattered. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. "He's back, Miss Meadowes," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Mr. Armitage. I saw his car, just before the worst of the storm hit. He didn't come to the main house. He went to the chapel." She clutched a small, tarnished silver locket in her other hand. My mother. She was a thorn. She told me stories, whispers of a hidden place beneath the chapel, a place where the first cantor conducted his celestial harmonies. She said the family tried to seal it, to silence it, but the bloodline, it always remembers the song. a hidden place. The first cantor. My academic instincts, however blunted by fear, began to connect the disparate threads. The Silent Cantor's, Brother Theron's disappearance. The strange musical notations in the Forbidden Codex. Mr. Armitage's obsessive scholarship. "We have to get the children out of here, Miss Finch," I said, my voice urgent. "There's no getting out in this storm, miss," she replied, her gaze flicking towards the window, where the trees thrashed like tormented spirits. "And I fear it's too late for that. He's come for them. For Lilia, especially. She's always been the stronger vessel." Just then, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A single resonant chime from the chapel bell. But this was no mournful toll. No warning. It was clear, almost triumphant, imbued with an unholy power that vibrated through the very foundations of the manor. It was followed by another, and another, the chimes coming faster, louder, forming a strange, compelling, almost hypnotic rhythm. Lilia gasped, her eyes snapping open wide, the unnerving luminosity intensified. She sat up, a serene, almost beatific smile on her face. "He's calling," she whispered, her voice no longer her own, but a chorus of layered, ethereal tones. "The cantor is ready. The opus must begin." She swung her legs out of bed, moving with a fluid grace that was unsettling in an 8-year-old. "Lilia, no!" Caleb cried, shrinking back. Before I could react, Lilia was out of the room, moving with an unnatural speed towards the sound of the bells. "The hymn, the offering stone." Miss Finch gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "He means to complete Theron's ritual." There was no choice. Leaving Caleb in the terrified but resolute care of Miss Finch, who promised to barricade the door and sing every nursery rhyme she knew if Lilia returned, I snatched up a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and plunged out into the storm-ravaged night. Towards the eerily chiming chapel, the chapel door, usually locked to Hlil, now stood ajar. A faint, pulsating light emanating from within. The air was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and ozone, and the sound of the bells was deafening, a mad, exultant symphony. Inside, the source of the light became clear. The great leather-bound codex on the pulpit was open, its pages glowing with an internal luminescence, the strange script and musical notations seeming to writhe like living things. And there, before the altar, stood Mr. Silas Armitage. He was no longer the cool, collected scholar. His silver hair was disheveled, his eyes burned with a fanatical zeal, and he was chanting in a high, keening voice, in a language I recognized as a bastardized form of liturgical Latin, mixed with something older, something guttural and resonant. Lilia stood beside him, her small face upturned, her eyes closed, her body swaying gently to the rhythm of the bells and Armitage's chant. She seemed to be in a trance. "Mr. Armitage," I shouted, my voice barely audible above the din. "Stop this!" "What are you doing to her?" He turned, a predatory smile twisting his lips. "Miss Meadowes, how opportune! You arrived just in time for the apotheosis." He gestured towards Lilia. "Behold, not a mere vessel, but the prima voca. The first voice, perfected. For generations, my predecessors, for I am not a thorn by blood, but by devotion, by understanding, have sought to restore the cantor's great work. Theron failed. Lilia's own parents, sentimental fools, tried to sever the connection. But I have nurtured it. The rules, Ms. Meadowes, were not to protect, but to attune. To refine her unique resonance until this very night, this perfect celestial alignment. The floor beneath the altar I now saw was a single, massive stone slab, carved with concentric circles and the same spidery symbols as the Codex. It began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. "The Cantor of Whispers," Armitage continued, his voice rising in fervor, "is not a mere spirit, Miss Meadowes. It is a consciousness. A symphony of pure, untainted knowledge, trapped between worlds by an incomplete ritual. Lilia, with her thorn blood, her perfect pitch, her innate sensitivity, will be the conduit, the final note that unlocks the gate. We will hear the music of the spheres, the true language of creation." He was clearly, dangerously insane, a zealot lost in his own arcane delusions. The bells reached a deafening crescendo. Lilia opened her eyes. They were no longer blue, but solid black, pools of infinite, terrifying emptiness. She raised her small hands, and a voice, ancient and powerful, a chorus of 1,000 whispering, singing voices, issued from her lips, weaving a complex, hypnotic melody that seemed to pluck at the very strings of my sanity. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The glowing symbols on the floor pulsed faster. This was it, the Opus, the release. Dr. Alaric Graves burst through the side sacristy door, his face grim, a heavy, iron-bound academic tome clutched in his hand. "Armitage, it's not a gate to knowledge you're opening. Theron's journals, I found them. That Cantor isn't a consciousness. It's a parasite. It consumes the voices, then the souls of its chosen singers to sustain its own accursed existence." Armitage merely laughed, a wild, exultant sound. "Ignorant fool, you cannot comprehend the beauty, the perfection, the entity, the Cantor, now almost fully manifest through Lilia. Turn its blank, black eyes towards Graves." The multi-layered voice intensified, and a wave of pure psychic force slammed into him, throwing him back against the stone wall. He crumpled, stunned. I had to act. My mind raced, sifting through everything I knew. The rules, the whispers, the children's fears, the Latin, the nature of resonance. If one twin starts to speak in Latin, and the other looks frightened, begins singing children's songs very loudly. It was about disrupting the harmony, creating a dissonance, but Lilia was too far gone. The entity was too strong. Then, Caleb's terrified words echoed in my mind. It wasn't Lilia. It was the man from the book. The one with no face, only a song. With no face. Only a song. And don't let him sing. Not the Star Eater's song. The Star Eater. An inversion. A devouring. The silent preacher. The Cantor of Whispers. The Codex on the pulpit. Its pages glowed, the source of the entity's power, its anchor. My Latin, my knowledge of ancient texts. It wasn't just a curse from my past. It had to be a weapon. I couldn't out-sing the Cantor, but perhaps I could unsing it, or sing something against it. I remembered a fragment from one of Theron's own scattered heretical writings that Dr. Graves had shown me. A passage discussing the antiphony of silence, a theoretical counter-ritual to undo a failed summoning, to impose a nullifying resonance. It required a specific, dissonant chant, spoken in a corrupted form of the same liturgical language the Cantor used, ignoring Armitage's triumphant cries. Ignoring the crushing psychic pressure, I focused on Lilia, on the entity within her. I took a deep breath and began to chant, my voice surprisingly steady, the strange guttural syllables of the antiphony of silence filling the chapel, clashing horribly with the Cantor's ethereal, multi-layered song. The effect was immediate and violent. The Cantor shrieked, a sound of 1,000 discordant notes tearing through the air. Lilia convulsed, her small body racked with spasms. The blackness in her eyes flickered. The glowing symbols on the floor sputtered and dimmed. Armitage stared, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "No, you defile the harmony. You silence the voice," he screamed, lunging at me. But the cantor, its connection to Lilia disrupted, its power waning, turned its unseen, unfelt rage upon its would-be master. A bolt of frigid energy, a silent scream made manifest, struck Armitage, throwing him back against the altar. He collapsed, his fanatical gleam extinguished, replaced by a look of utter, uncomprehending horror. The bells in the tower fell silent, one by one. The unholy light from the Codex faded. Lilia crumpled to the floor, unconscious. But her eyes, when they fluttered open for a moment, were her own clear, frightened blue once more. The storm outside still raged, but within the chapel, a new, fragile silence had fallen. A silence that felt, for the first time, truly empty. The silence in the chapel, following the violent cessation of the cantor's unholy symphony, was a physical entity. It pressed in on us, thick and heavy, tasting of ozone, sulfur from my imagined counter-chant, and the lingering, cloying sweetness of lilies now rapidly fading. The storm still battered the ancient stones outside, a wild elemental rage. But within these walls, the true tempest had passed. Lilia lay still on the cold stone floor where she had fallen, her breathing shallow but regular. I rushed to her side, my heart aching with a mixture of terror and profound relief. Her face, pale in the flickering lamplight I'd managed to relight, was blessedly her own. The vast empty blackness had retreated from her eyes, leaving only the frightened blue of a child who had journeyed too far into the dark. Dr. Graves, groaning, pushed himself up from where had been thrown against the wall. He clutched his head, but his eyes were clear, focused. Coraline. My God. What was that chant you used? The antiphony of silence, I whispered, my throat raw, from Theron's own heresies. A way to unravel a compromised summoning. I prayed it would work. It had been a desperate gamble, a linguistic Hail Mary. Mr. Silas Armitage lay crumpled at the foot of the altar, conscious but broken. The fanatical light had been extinguished from his eyes, replaced by a dazed, uncomprehending emptiness. The psychic backlash from the cantor, as its connection was forcibly severed, had clearly shattered more than just his ambitions. He stared blankly at the now dark Codex on the pulpit, its pages inert, their unholy luminescence gone. It was just an old book now, albeit one filled with terrible potential. Miss Finch, who had braved the storm to follow us, appeared in the chapel doorway. Caleb huddled behind her, his small face streaked with tears. When he saw Lilia stir me, reassuringly stroking her hair, he let out a choked sob of relief and ran to his sister's side. The bells. I've stopped, Miss Finch said, her voice filled with a weary awe. For the first time in, I don't know how long. The air feels clean. Together, we carried Lilia back to the manor house, leaving Armitage to whatever fate awaited him when the storm broke and the authorities could be summoned. Dr. Graves, his historical curiosity momentarily sated by a far too real brush with the arcane, agreed that the less said about the cantor and the antiphony, the better. A sudden, violent psychological episode on Armitage's part, exacerbated by the storm and his obsessive studies, would be the official narrative. The children, thankfully, were young enough that their accounts, however fantastical, could be attributed to fear and imagination. The rest of the night was spent in a state of watchful exhaustion. Lilia slept deeply, Caleb refusing to leave her side. Miss Finch, her usual reserve replaced by a quiet, fierce protectiveness, brewed endless cups of tea and spoke, for the first time, of her own mother's fragmented warnings about Chapelwoods, singing sickness, and the shadow in the belfry. She confessed she'd always left lilies at the chapel, an old folk remedy her grandmother had taught her, meant to soothe troubled spirits. though she now feared it may have inadvertently fed the Cantor's presence. As dawn approached, the storm finally abated. The first rays of a watery sun pierced the ravaged clouds, illuminating a world washed clean, yet irrevocably changed. The chapel stood silent against the bruised sky, its bell tower no longer a source of dread, but simply an old stone structure. Yet, the silence it now held was different. It wasn't the watchful, waiting silence of before. It was an empty silence, a hollowed-out silence, the silence of a hymn abruptly and permanently faded. Dr. Graves managed to get a call out once the phone lines were partially restored. He spoke to the county sheriff, his voice calm and authoritative, painting a picture of a disturbed benefactor and a terrifying night trapped by the weather. He carefully omitted any mention of ancient entities or Latin counter chants. Later that morning, as official vehicles finally made their way up the muddy driveway, I looked at Lily and Caleb, asleep now in the same bed, their small hands clasped. They were safe, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the echoes of Chapelwood, the memory of the Cantor's song, would linger within them, within all of us who had heard it, a subtle, unheard note in the symphony of our lives. The aftermath of that night at Chapelwood unfolded with a surreal, almost anticlimactic banality. Zila's Armitage was taken into custody, his vacant stares and rambling pronouncements about celestial harmonies and broken opuses quickly leading to a diagnosis of acute psychosis. He was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, his vast collection of arcane texts impounded by bewildered authorities who cataloged them as mere curiosities of a disturbed mind. The official report cited the extreme weather and Mr. Armitage's pre-existing eccentricities as the cause of the night's events. No mention was made of bells tolling on their own, or children speaking in dead languages. Dr. Alaric Graves, to his credit, became a steadfast presence in the children's lives. With no other kin, and with Mr. Armitage's guardianship clearly untenable, provisional custody of Lilia and Caleb was granted to Miss Tabitha Finch, whose quiet strength and deep affection for the twins had finally fully emerged. Dr. Graves assisted her, providing a stable, paternal influence and ensuring that children received counseling, though of a very mundane, non-supernatural variety. My role as GSA was, Puberian, over. Yet, I found I couldn't quite bring myself to leave Chapelwood immediately, didn't I? Stripped of Armitage's oppressive influence and the Cantor's chilling resonance, began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, albeit one haunted by profound memories. I stayed on for a few weeks, helping Miss Finch and Dr. Graves create a semblance of normalcy for Lilia and Caleb. The chapel was thoroughly searched by Dr. Graves and myself. We found the hidden HEM, a damp, circular chamber directly beneath the altar, its walls covered in faded, disturbing frescoes depicting scenes of ecstatic worship and unsettling figures with musical instruments. The great stone slab, the offering stone as Finch had called it, was cold and inert. We found no other physical trace of the Cantor or Brother Theron, only an overwhelming sense of ancient misguided devotion and profound sorrow. The leather-bound Codex, after much debate, was entrusted to Dr. Graves, who planned to donate it to a secure academic archive specializing in dangerous texts, under strict conditions of non-dissemination. Lilia and Caleb slowly recovered, though the shadows of that night would likely never fully leave them. Lilia no longer spoke in Latin, nor did she hum those strange melancholic melodies. Caleb's nightmares lessened, yet sometimes I would see a distant, knowing look in Lilia's eyes, or catch Caleb staring at the silent chapel tower with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. The day I finally left Chapelwood, Miss Finch pressed a small, antique silver music box into my hand. "My mother gave this to me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She said it played a song of forgetting, for when the old hymns grew too loud. It played a simple, heartbreakingly beautiful folk lullaby. I returned to my own life, to the world of academia, but it was different now. My controversial translation of the Serpent's Codex no longer seemed like a failure, but a precursor, a first fumbling glimpse into a world of resonant, potent language that lay just beneath the surface of our own. I continued my research, but with a new, profound caution, a deep respect for the power of words and the silences between them. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind sighs in a particular way, I think I can hear the faint, distant echo of Chapelwood's chimes, not the triumphant, terrifying peals of the Cantor's Crescendo, but the single, mournful tolls that had first warned of its presence. And sometimes, when I look at an ancient text, or hear a particularly resonant piece of music, I feel a familiar chill, a stirring of something old and powerful. I often wonder about Lilia and Caleb. I know Dr. Graves and Miss Finch are doing their best to give them a normal, happy childhood, to fill their lives with ordinary children's songs. But I also know that they heard the Cantor's hymn, felt its touch. They are, in their own way, keepers of a silence that once screamed. And I, Coraline Meadowes, am a keeper too, a keeper of the antiphony, of the knowledge that some songs are best left unsung, some silences inviolate, and sometimes, when the world feels too loud, too chaotic, I open the little silver music box Miss Finch gave me, and in its simple, unaccompanied melody, I find a fragile human counterpoint to the vast, echoing chorus of the unknown. The silence after the song is the deepest. You've heard it now. The unsettling truth of Chapelwood, the terror of the Cantor, the desperate gamble that saved 2 children and shattered a man. It wasn't just a house. It was an instrument, tuned to an ancient, terrible frequency. The rules, they weren't just strange. They were the notes in a macabre symphony. And the twist? Did it leave you breathless? Did you see it coming? Or did the shadows hide it too well? The echoes of Chapelwood will linger, not just in the stone, but in the silence between heartbeats. Tell us what part of this haunting tale resonated most with you. The bells? The book? The chilling voice of the Cantor? Leave your comments below. This was a journey into the heart of darkness, a true test of sanity. If you survived this night with us, and crave more stories that crawl under your skin, then be sure to subscribe to Night Creepypasta Rules. The night holds many more unsung horrors, and we are here to give them a voice. Until the next unsettling chime, sleep well, if you can.